assumptions we have in coma science when we actually try to infer consciousness in non-communicative patients. And so I just wanted to share that for discussion. So here, by consciousness, I mean subjective experience, what it is like, for example, to perceive a scene, endure pain, to entertain a thought, or reflect on the experience itself. All these are different types of experiences. None of these contents are necessary. But basically, it's what it's like to be someone home. And then when consciousness fades, as it does during dreamless sleep, the entire world from the perspective of the subject vanishes. And I'm kind of stressing this definition because I do think that's actually what we're trying to detect in patients with coma. Is there anybody home? Is there any experiencer behind the stare, right? So, well, I know I'm conscious. If I want to infer you're conscious, the best I have is subjective reports from you telling me what you feel. But then in coma patients, we don't really have that, and that's kind of where the problem raises. Before going to there, though, you know, when we try to diagnose consciousness in non-communicative patients, we can ask two different kind of questions. Is consciousness present or absent? Is there anybody home? Like I was saying, is there an experiencer behind the stare? Or a content-specific question, do they have self-awareness, awareness of the environment? Do they understand what I say? Are they in pain? These are more like content-specific questions. The global question is a prerequisite. Of course, you need to have consciousness to be present. And the content-specific question is an additional one, yeah? But these are two different types. And yes, ultimately, these ethical questions target consciousness defined as subjective experience. Is there anything it feels like to be this patient? And if so, how exactly do they feel like? When we discussed with Olivia at some point in a review paper that not only we need to know if someone is at home, but ideally we also want to know if it's a life worth living, are they in pain? All these different questions are actually both about how they feel, yeah? And so, by definition, non-communicative patients cannot provide reports of subjective experience, and then, thus, necessarily, we need to use other definitions of consciousness. The gold standard for assessing subjective experience are reports, right? But we don't have them. And so that's where the tricky part comes, yeah? And so we need to use other definitions. What kind of definitions can we use? I'll just give 4, and then we'll briefly review them, you know, and kind of the issues and interesting things about them too. And again, I'll just try to be quick enough, but I don't want to be too quick. And but it's good. The goal is that you guys like throw me tomatoes or give me feedback or we discuss. Okay. So the first one you can use, well, obviously, is the behavioral definition. Hi, Ursula. And the behavioral definition is basically, you know, this assumption that consciousness goes with complex behaviors, but trying to infer consciousness not from reports, but from behavior. I'll discuss that. Second one you could use is there a particular kind of function here meant kind of cognitive function. So rather than looking at the body like a black box and, you know, looking at behavior, you're going to try to look at some neuronal, you know, processes. And you try to infer consciousness from these functions. And then another one is kind of looking at neural correlates of consciousness. So not only a particular function that can only be done if you're conscious, but just also like making sure that it holds across conscious and unconscious states, yeah? And then the last one is also theoretical. Imagine that we would have one day a theory that is well accepted, predicting some particular feature being linked to neuronal activity. That would be like the most general and ideal. Everybody's working on this. Still, at this point, I just wanted to say it kind of so inform the NCC search and there's the diagnostic search, yeah? But these kind of are the 4 different ones. Kind of, I mean, again, it's the box things, but box, as you know, may be useful sometimes. So what about this behavioral definition? Of course, we use it all the time when we define MCS versus VS. But remember this controversy now, you know, minimally conscious. What do you mean minimally conscious? Are they actually minimally responsive? What it is like? What is it like to be in minimally conscious state? And even more like, are they conscious or not? Like sometimes, you know, it's like if you just have fixation, what do you say? Are they really like fully conscious? What do you know, right? So one thing that seems to be well accepted is that, say, if you have like someone reciting a poetry at the presidential inauguration in the United States, that person will be conscious. So the availability of a rich behavioral repertoire, most people, except maybe some philosophers, will say, okay, if you have that, you must be conscious. But then in the coma recovery scale, this is not this kind of complex behavior necessarily that we look at, except, like communication, of course, if you have that, then again, you're like in the world of subjective reports. But if patients show these simpler behaviors, actually, sometimes they're more difficult to interpret. And then if you don't have any behavioral responsiveness, doesn't mean the patient is unconscious. And the MCS, as you know, they fluctuate a lot. You need at least 5 to 7 times the coma recovery scale. You can easily miss Liz. Now we're doing a better job. And then also, well, in sleep, for example, you dream 2/3 of the time, even during non-REM sleep. And so if you're unresponsive, you can very well be conscious. And if you want to rule out consciousness, the absence of behavior is actually not enough. And we kind of put this together in a Curing Coma campaign paper or so recently that, okay, in normal wakefulness, you're responsive, you're connected to the environment, and you're conscious. But you can have also some conditions where you're actually not responsive, and you're connected to the environment, so you perceive the environment, but you just cannot respond. And then a lot of cases dreaming under anesthesia or sleep, for example, where you actually there is an experiencer, there is an experience in the form of a dream. That is also ethically important to detect, right? And disorders of consciousness, we have to say, well, actually, sometimes it's difficult to know where they are in there. They're unresponsive, it's tough. And then, while very complex behavior are widely accepted to require consciousness, a lot of others remain equivocal. And actually, that's a slide from Olivia. Majority of patients with MCS, they actually have like fixation, visual pursuit, or some kind of localization, but you don't really know what it means. If you have some response to command, it's a bit clear, but a lot of them actually, they have these ambiguous behaviors that are difficult to interpret. And then now, like again, a slide from Olivia, you come up with all these like olfaction response, sound localization. Now there's a multiplication of behaviors that seem to be, interesting, but what do they mean? Furthermore, if you try to integrate behavioral assessment, and kind of what we do in coma patients with the rest of science of consciousness, you come up with another issue, which is that notion of blindsight. It's actually a prevalent notion that consciousness is useless, that actually you can do a lot of things unconsciously for behavior. And that came up with Weisskranz and others, that that it seems to be that there's a lot of things you can do unconsciously. So how reliably do purposeful behaviors actually reflect consciousness? And then you're like, oh, I'm stuck, because like if I consider like a simple response to command even being, a sign of consciousness, and then people with blindsight, they can do all this stuff, like what does it mean, right? And here actually the devil is in the details. There has been a lot of discussions over the last few years on how exactly to assess this. So the blindsight is an ability for patients who have lesion of primary visual cortex to respond to visual stimuli that they deny seeing. That's the definition of it. Yeah. And so there's that very recent paper with Hakwan and Joseph Ledoux, in PNS, that discussed that it's a clinical condition that is most often discussed in the contemporary science of consciousness. And basically, they are consciously blind, but they can see sufficiently to control behavior. That's the claim, yeah? And they say that this is actually a clinical case to show how much you can actually do unconsciously, because they deny seeing the stimuli, but they can do things about it. I don't think I'll have time to show it, but I strongly encourage you to look at this video, and I'll summarize it for you. The patient here is actually, maybe I'll just go to the end, is kind of following the dot on the screen. And he's doing that super well. Like all the time, it goes on like for 20 minutes nearly. It feels like 20 minutes, sorry, just doing that like super well all the time. And then at the end, Weisskranz is actually asking him, do you see the stimulus or not? And I'm trying to see.
Can you describe it? Graham, can you tell me what sort of experience you had that made you move your arm?
I just know something's moving over in the right field.
So the patient said, I just felt something's moving over in the right field, which is not unconsciousness, this is partial awareness. And the patient was actually able to do exactly what he was saying. But then Weisskranz asked him, did you see anything? He said, no. But this is not complete unawareness, yeah? And that's kind of the whole issue with Blindsight is that. And I'll just summarize, I think, again, I can share my slides, but the literature and the assessments of consciousness in Blindsight patient actually, when you don't take consciousness all or none, but you acknowledge that there could be some features of the stimulus that are perceived, but not everything. Actually, the evidence is that they do have some degraded conscious vision going with behavior. So, and then, they kind of describe type 1 and type 2 Blindsight. Type 1 is with not any feeling. Type 2 is with a kind of feeling. And they discuss if feeling is conscious or not. But basically, it really, the devil is in the details. There's a very nice study by Overgaard in one patient with Blindsight, where basically she had a visual field defect on one quadrant. And if you ask binary questions versus this kind of more continuous consciousness scale with partial awareness in it, you get very different results. Blindsight is actually obtained if you ask binary questions. But if you account for partial awareness, you don't find Blindsight anymore. So what I'm saying here is that more research has to be done, but it looks like the cases of Blindsight, actually all the cases I could see in the literature, there would be more this kind of type 2 Blindsight with partial awareness going with behavior. And the evidence that patients with Blindsight would actually be able to do many things unconsciously is actually not there. So there's more research to do, which I think is important to kind of unify this story of how much behavior can be unconscious or not, and infer this in patients, yeah? Yeah, anyway. And then there was also some literature about Blindsight in normotypical individuals. And so a case from Hagwan Low showing actually dissociation between behavior and performance with some post-hoc selection of stimuli, and then some correlates of more awareness in the frontal cortex. But actually, there has been also some controversy about these, a lot of different studies that performed that were demonstrating unconscious processing in healthy volunteers, with the fact that there were a lot of them had post-hoc stimuli selection with kind of outlier stimuli where at very low intensity of stimulus you actually say you perceive them, but it's only a minority of them. And again, you can read that paper, Shanks 2007, if you're interested. But basically, in the most recent studies that don't do that, also Liad Mudrik had a famous paper, where she did this kind of analysis of what can you do to integrate information consciously or unconsciously, and she found she couldn't reproduce her first results of finding high-level integration unconsciously. She actually found a Bayesian statistics show that there was more evidence for no unconscious processing when she was doing it. So there has been a lot of methodological issues in these studies that demonstrated the presence of some, at least a lot of unconscious processing. I don't say there's none, but there's a lot to be done about, like revisiting the field, because it's actually in a lot of discussions. Also, depending how you do it, if you try to avoid this post-hoc selection, but you look more at the overall awareness curve and the dissociation between awareness and say behavioral accuracy to categorize shapes, for example, the accuracy here is on in black, and the awareness scale is in gray. 1 is no awareness, 3 is clear awareness, and you can see that when you are at the lowest scale of the lowest rating, mostly not seeing the stimuli, you're actually behaviorally attentive. And Christian Sandberg had done some very interesting other analysis of dissociation between consciousness and behavior, and actually showing that if you're actually completely unconscious in the lowest stimuli intensity, there is no dissociation between consciousness and and awareness, which means there is no evidence for unconscious processing in this case. Yeah. Another, and I don't know if you read that one yet, Bene, but this is a nice paper from Hak-Wan Lau and Megan Peters, actually confirming this, that they couldn't reproduce Blindsight when it was properly tested with the continuous scale. They couldn't reproduce Blindsight in normal subjects. And they were actually hypothesizing the different things. Like Hak-Wan is a student from Wisecrans, and he published these things on Blindsight. So they were kind of trying to find this ideal situation where consciousness is associated from performance, which makes sense, so that you can actually look really at what goes with consciousness and not with performance, but they actually couldn't find it. They say that they had a surprising finding suggesting that the threshold for subjective awareness and objective discrimination were actually effectively the same. And if objective task performance was above chance, there was likely conscious experience. So they actually looked at two different models. One would be like Blindsight, where you have performance without awareness. And then you had performance a bit better than awareness for like this kind of intermediate scale, which is something that you can find commonly in the studies. There is some dissociation, like if you actually have partial awareness of something, you can do a lot with it. But they actually found evidence for that model, so no evidence for Blindsight. And they also said that if you look at the modeling, this can be a Bayesian optimal. So there's the same threshold for awareness and discrimination task. And we found some other paper with Benedetta, just having fun reviewing this, that seemed to be the case, that there's no evidence when you look at these kind of continuous scales, being confidence ratings or perceptual awareness scales, of a real dissociation between the two, at least for a lot of behaviors. So why do I care? Why do we care? Why should we care? But because actually now maybe there's with these kind of new findings, there is a promising way to integrate behavioral science of coma and then behavioral science of consciousness, even in normotypical or in patients together, and try to really maybe better understand what it means. These, fixation, visual pursuit, we kind of like test all the behaviors to see if that they can be done consciously or unconsciously. But if you look at the statistics, just a few of them, like fixation, visual pursuit, localization, we could actually test them with the newest kind of methods and try to figure this out, try to see how we can actually infer. I was discussing with Leonel Nakashtu at some point a few years ago, and I really like that notion of a cortical, mediated state. I think it's true that these kind of behaviors try to pick up cortical function, but we don't know per se yet if they're conscious or not. But there might be some ways to actually figure this out. So that's to discuss. Okay. And then another thing about functional definition now. So again, like you're not trying to use behavior, but you're trying to kind of infer consciousness from the presence of a particular cognitive function. And here, looking not only at behavior, but like mostly at brain activity. And we've done that, like there are some specific cognitive functions that, we've done that in the field, that are thought to require consciousness. I guess at some point it was. Again, it might have to be revisited with the newer standard, but attention, working memory, executive function, reflection, decision-making, all these functions are thought to be kind of consequences of consciousness in a way. But so instead of assessing cognition from behavior and using the brain as a black box, we kind of look at what's going on in the brain. And right, and so that's kind of what had been done in the early stages of for coma patients. Say Nico Schaef was like looking at responses to text, yeah, and then also response to own names, or like even like looking at activation to pain, yeah, all these different areas that were activated much more in minimally conscious states than in vegetative state. So how much can you infer about consciousness from this? Well, the issue is again that and then that study from Lorena Nachi and Ed, in which is also kind of the top of kind of the passive paradigm, as we call it, cognitive function, is like you watch a Hitchcock movie and you see how many different networks are activated in response to movie in synchrony, like between subjects and all this. I mean, it's very elegant. You can find that when the movie is kind of getting suspenseful, then you have more activation of that attentional network, and some patients actually show that or not. So how can you infer? What can you infer from this? Again, the discussion is open because you can have a lot of passive brain responses unconsciously, and that's like emotional stimuli, for example. And so that's why, like, at some point we were discussing active paradigms, being you assess if there is a response to command through neuroimaging that you only find after the command, but not after passive stimuli. And so one thing that actually but is still, I think, accepted by most is, again, equivalent to very complex behaviors. It's kind of common sense without any theory of consciousness that if you can imagine playing tennis, you know, and find that response only when you ask and not at rest, you know, and then when you're asked to imagine watching, moving around your home, you actually activate the spatial network. If you have that, then everybody would agree. Everybody, I know that the patient is most likely conscious, yeah. But equivalent to complex behaviors, again, this kind of assumption. And then, you know, if you find these very specific responses, you know, in response to question, you can also communicate. So this kind of still holds that very complex cognition, like mixing for 30 seconds and all that, you know, like this different response to command, very specific. You need to be conscious for it. But it's not the case for every active paradigm. So, for example, what Garo had done, which I think is a very elegant study of trying to ask the patient to count their own names, and most minimally conscious patients could do that. This actually is less generally accepted as a, you know, less widely used as a marker for consciousness. And then also, again, there is a controversy about what, you know, what attention, you might have a dissociation between the two, working memory, you might also have that goal activation. There's still some controversy about this in the field, yeah. And even actually, I was saying the tennis was well accepted because even in the most recent paper from Klassen in the New England, there was some discussion. If you look at the title of the paper, it's not voluntary brain activity like Martin Monti and Audrey had. Now it's called brain responses or something, brain activation. And the story behind the lines is actually that Jan Klassen submitted that paper as voluntary brain activity. And some reviewers said, no, I don't think so. I think you should just be more cautious about it. One of the reasons might be it's black box, it's 10 seconds rather than 30 seconds. But again, like not every active paradigm is actually entrusted to be fully reliable, you know? So it's kind of interesting to notice this. And also it goes with the fact that at the end, we might still want, like for behavior, to validate these as NCC and going to do the NCC approach. Can you do that when you're asleep? Can you do that under anesthesia? Can you do that if you don't hear a command or whatever, yeah? And so from behavior and, you know, behavior and then cognition, that's kind of looking at behavior versus looking at the brain, you have the same thing at the end. A lot or most of the behaviors and cognitive functions are still discussed. It's not obvious that you actually, they require consciousness, at least yet. There's a lot of progress in the field, a lot of interesting things to look at. But at the end, we're kind of back to the NCC approach. Yeah? And by neurocorrelates of consciousness, we actually want more than a correlation. We want really a specific association that it should be the minimal neuronal mechanism jointly sufficient for any conscious percept. And so each time the conscious percept is there, the NCC is there. And if you induce the NCC, you induce a percept. If you inactivate it, you eliminate it. So it's really like a mechanistic, you know, this kind of really predictive, strong prediction approach. It's more than a correlation. It's really looking at what is the type of brain activity that makes a difference. Yeah. And so again, you have the global approach, like our two questions. Is there someone or not, like home or not? And then you have the content specific approach. And that's a different question because again, that's in subjects that are already conscious. And then you look at some particular contents of consciousness. And here, a lot of work in the field has been done kind of with task-based paradigms and very useful, like masking, kind of equating the stimuli, you know, properties, and then see what kind of brain activity changes you find. But actually, it's also very valid to, and it's necessary to confirm what you find in these studies, properly done with spatial awareness and all that, you know, with other studies, for example, spontaneous thoughts or like clearly visible stimuli, the NCC should also be there. If I see a face on the screen, very visible versus no face, there should be the union of the two should be the NCC, yeah? Both are actually complementary. And a lot of studies have been using this, but there's also more recrudescence in the field, more interest now, and I think it's very justified to look beyond this kind of threshold paradigms, but also combine both. Yeah. So, yeah. Now, the NCC should be a specific neuronal process that accurately predict the presence or absence of consciousness. And again, two different questions. Are you looking at a conscious state? Conscious is not. Or are you looking at some particular contents, which might be there or not if you're conscious, yeah? So, and then actually they can dissociate to, like, say, if you take TMS as a stimulus, you know that very well, right? It's like one of the best we have. It can really help differentiate conscious versus unconscious state, but you don't perceive the stimulus per se. And so you can assess the full NCC without focusing on particular conscious content. And you need to validate them with subjective reports. But so the markers of conscious content, they also can be validated separately using subjective reports during conscious state. But it's just good to kind of remember these are two different questions as well. And see, again, the target for diagnosis, ethical questions, are you going to withdraw life support or not? Is there any subjective experience? And why I'm insisting on validating the NCC on subjective reports is because that's the best we have. So if we look at MCS versus VS, it's kind of a circular loop question. We're looking at behavior. We don't really know what behavior means, yeah? And then we're trying to validate the NCC on this. This is kind of much more limited. It's really important to do also these other studies like you guys are doing, but I'm just kind of saying, and I mean, I've done that. My PhD was MCS versus VS, but it's more about inferring what MCS feel like rather than just really looking at NCC to me, because yes, we know like 10-20% of patients might play tennis, but then we don't really know about the other ones. We don't know if they're conscious or not. So we have to kind of face the limitations of that. So some patients in VS may still be conscious. Significance of many behaviors in MCS is still unknown. And then if you look at this kind of more cognitive function, or imagine playing tennis, is also some limitation. So that's why I'm saying, like, it's really good to keep that in mind and continue. I'm saying this too because I think in the Curing Coma campaign, there's not much accent yet on the fact that we should really integrate coma science with the rest of the consciousness science if we want to make progress. I think it's really important, but again, you can't tell me. I think I'll skip that part. Anyway, there's a whole discussion about NCC that you need to integrate lesion study, stimulation study, like direct intracranial stimulation and recording, neuroimaging, the three of them together. As much as you need to integrate the threshold paradigm and the supra-threshold paradigms, you also need to integrate all this. So it's kind of a big picture work, yeah? Because looking only in one condition, you might find something that is predictive, but it's not predictive in another condition. And so that's kind of what we tried to review recently, and I'll skip all that. I could talk an hour about this. But just basically, if I go on, you can use neuroimaging in different ways, try to predict at the individual level. Sorry, but I don't think I'll have time. Big picture that seems to emerge, though, is that if you dissociate consciousness from its consequences, like in the recent studies, you actually find that a lot of the neural correlates of consciousness are actually in the back of the brain, not so much involving the front of the brain. Also, lesion studies, if you lesion the frontal cortex, large part of it, the patients are not unconscious. If you lesion the back, it's much more of a problem. So the NCC approach has been fruitful, but also, you know, it's a big integrative work. And it might also be that we are missing that one condition where it won't be predictive and we don't know yet. So the NCC, definitely, we should continue to do this and potentially even do that for, like, informed by the kind of patterns we see in patients, yeah, like for behavior and all the kind of cognitive function. I mean, there's still a lot of work to do on NCC and combining clinical and recording studies, trying to find some hypothesis about how it may work. And here, you know, the hypothesis we have on our side is that it seems to be that a lot of the conscious contents are actually specified in the back of the brain. There might be some involvement in the front for some contents, but we're not sure. The frontal cortex, for sure, seems to be involved in this kind of processing loops or consequences of consciousness, like report, you know, or motor behavior. But a lot of content seems to be encoded by the specified actually specified by different parts of the back of the brain. You can have like low level content like B1, and then high level content like places or faces, and this, if you lesion that part of the brain, you're also unconscious. So there seems to be an overlap between the full NCC and the content specific ones. So it doesn't seem that the whole cortex is as important everywhere, but it's really kind of a specialization and integration at the same time. That said, these are like the NCC approach. There's a lot of progress, especially dissociating consciousness from consequences, dissociating target detection from experience itself. Yeah, but still a lot of work to be done. But at the end, as I said, the NCC, it's kind of good, it's correlational, it's predictive, but you might still miss something you don't know. Like a classical example for me was like, okay, in vegetative state you have, or like in anesthesia, you have decreased cortical metabolism. But then in seizures, it's actually normal or increased sometimes. And you might always find that kind of exception to the rule. And that kind of integrative work also in a way that you need to do for NCC, you also need to do that for theory work. So the theoretical, work on consciousness is really trying to integrate all the evidence and try to find an explanation for it and some markers that really are reliable, right? So NCC and theory, these kind of two approaches, empirical and theoretical, really go together in my mind. And again, say, imagine one day we would have a theory that is well accepted, and we say, okay, there's experience, and then we have an explanation for all the, like, both why it is there or not, and then we can predict from the structural information, like what kind of contents we have. Then it would be actually very powerful to infer both if there's someone home and how, the patient feels, but we're not there yet. But still, you can use these theory hypotheses to generate some potentially, useful markers, and then test them with the validation approach we discussed. And so again, like, all that by heart, but that's kind of what Marcello did. Integration and differentiation have to go together. This comes from IIT, yeah? Like these fundamental properties of experience that should be there every time if you're conscious. Unlike this cognitive function, like you could have attention, you could have language, these are not fundamental properties, but like integration, the fact that you have one experience, and then differentiation, the fact that you have many different parts, many different distinctions in your experience that are integrated together. These are fundamental properties of consciousness coming from theory that you can test. But again, like, you need to validate still these a la NCC and validate them on subjective reports. Yeah. And so that's kind of the approach, like the approach that Marcello had done. You can look also how patients recover, but this is always an inference in the patients, and validation has to be done in like sleep, anesthesia, or conscious patients that can report. Yeah? But then still, it can be useful, like what that old paper, but in order to also have a theory approach to kind of integrate all these different patterns of brain activity and all these different modalities we have, and try to see, okay, like if I'm using that framework, then with TMS-EEG, I should see this, with restrictive fMRI, I should see this, and kind of have a critical discussion of not only like the theory you use, but like how much you can infer from the different techniques. But I do think that combining the NCC with this kind of integration approach can be very fruitful. And to me, that's also like something I'm looking forward to more. So that's kind of what I wanted to submit as thoughts for your feedback and discussion. Again, that's tricky. We try to infer if there's someone home or not. Non-communicative patients, they cannot give us reports, and then you need to kind of use the tools you get. Behavior, well, it's an open question, but it's an interesting question, because actually there might be that if we look at these behaviors that we find in MCS, it might be that actually some of them are clearly something you cannot do unconsciously, and some might. We don't know yet, but there is some work to be done that could be done there. Same for cognition. I mean, we could actually revisit, because a lot of these, as I mentioned, there was a lot of studies that had methodological problems of looking at outliers, like in a post-hoc selection with regression to the mean. There might be actually a lot of interesting things to look at in terms of partial awareness effect also. If you have no idea that the stimulus is even presented on the screen, can you actually do anything about it? We don't know yet. it's likely you will find some dissociations, but it's important for us to kind of figure this out, like in an integrated manner, yeah, like looking at behavior in coma and then looking at behavior in subjects that can report and validate them. And same for the NCC. It's very interesting and important to look at brain activity patterns in MCS versus VS, but it's so important to continue what we're doing to validate these different markers and looking at sensitivity and specificity, you know, in different other states, because we cannot validate them in patients themselves. And then NCC, you really need to be broad. You need to see if everything fits. We want a predictor, like a strong, you know, validated marker that survives lesion studies, stimulation studies, neuroimaging, prediction approach, dissociation approach, everything. So I mean, it's kind of a big work, a teamwork. And then, you know, for conscious state, you have less number of states to study, but then say a particular conscious content, it's like a huge, if you want to carve this NCC even for one single content from all the different consequences or task-related compounds and everything, like using threshold. It has been done for faces maybe the most, yeah, but threshold, stimuli, and supra-threshold, it's a huge work too. And it's really useful to complement this with theory, where you kind of try to really find not only an explanation for what you observe, but also come up with some new predictions. And also what has is done now, and I'm very excited to be part of that too, like with the Templeton, you know, comparing different theories on predictions and see like what holds the most, and try to understand also what the differences and similarities are between them. Yeah, so these are really all kind of going together, but I do think we're in a very exciting time for the field and also for coma science to kind of get even more integrated with the rest of consciousness science. Yeah, need more progress in consciousness science in order to understand coma better. That sounds maybe like obvious, but I think not everybody, especially in the clinical world, would actually think that. But I think that's the case. And that's it.